My mother smiled at me across the dinner table, the same warm smile she used to give me when I was a little girl and she was about to tell me something wonderful. Except this time, the words that came out of her mouth were not wonderful. They were the beginning of a war. "We've decided," she said, cutting into her chicken like she was discussing the weather, "that it makes more sense for the cottage to go to your brother. His parents gave you, but you understand, don't you, sweetheart?" I set my fork down very slowly. The cottage she was talking about wasn't hers. It wasn't my father's. It wasn't even, technically, my husband's anymore. It was mine. Deeded to me, and only me, by my father-in-law, 11 months before he died, because of something I did for that family that my own family never even knew about. And now my mother was sitting in my dining room, eating food I paid for, telling me she was passing away a home I owned outright, to my brother, the man who hadn't spoken to our dying father-in-law once in 3 years. I smiled back at her. I said, "Of course, Mom. Let's talk about it." She had no idea that by the end of that month, she would regret ever opening her mouth. Because I already knew something she didn't. And what I found out over the next 4 weeks didn't just save my cottage, it exposed exactly what my mother and my brother had been doing behind my back for over a year. Let me back up and tell you how this all started. My name is Rachel. I'm 34 years old, and I grew up in a house where love was a currency, and my brother Kyle held all of it. Kyle is 2 years older than me. Growing up, if Kyle broke curfew, it was because he was exploring his independence. If I broke curfew, I lost my phone for a month. When Kyle failed out of his first semester of college, my parents took out a loan to send him back. When I got a partial scholarship to state school, my mother asked if I was sure I wanted to waste it on a degree that wouldn't lead anywhere. I don't say this to complain. I say this because you need to understand the pattern before you understand what happened at that dinner table, because none of it was random. It was the same story my family had been telling for 30 years, just with higher stakes. By the time I was 28, I had built a life that had nothing to do with my parents' help. I worked as a physical therapist. I met my husband, Daniel, at the clinic where his mother came in twice a week for rehab after a stroke. Daniel's family was different from mine in almost every way. Quiet. Steady. They didn't measure love by how loud you could ask for it. Daniel's parents, Frank and Elaine, owned a lake cottage 2 hours north of the city. Nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, a dock, a wood stove that smoked if you didn't open the flue all the way. It had been in Frank's family for 2 generations. It was the place where Daniel had learned to swim, where his parents had gotten married on the dock in 1979, where the family gathered every July 4th without fail. When Elaine had her stroke, I was the one who drove up every weekend to help with her physical therapy exercises myself, off the clock, unpaid, because I loved her and because the clinic she'd started at didn't have weekend hours. I was the one who sat with Frank in the hospital hallway at 2 a.m. when they weren't sure if Elaine would walk again. I was the one who learned to can tomatoes and split firewood and keep the cottage running the summer Elaine couldn't. My own mother visited exactly once that whole year. She said hospitals made her anxious. Elaine did recover mostly. And 2 years later, when Frank was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I became the one who managed his medications, who drove him to Rochester for his second opinion, who sat with him through 4 rounds of chemo while Daniel worked to keep our household afloat. Call didn't come once. My mother sent a card. 11 months before Frank passed, he called me into his study at the cottage. He had a folder in his lap. "Rachel," he said, "I've watched you for 6 years. You've done more for this family than blood ever did. Elaine and I want the cottage to go to you. Not to Daniel and you jointly to you. In your name." I told him that was too much, that it should go to Daniel, that it was Daniel's childhood home. Frank shook his head. "Daniel loves this place," he said, "but you're the one who kept it alive. And I want to know, before I go, that whatever happens in this world, you'll always have a piece of ground that's yours. Nobody can take that from you. Nobody in your family, nobody in mine. It's yours." We had the deed drawn up by his lawyer that same month. Frank passed 7 months later, peacefully, at the cottage, looking out at the lake. I never told my parents the deed was solely in my name. I didn't see the point. It felt private, sacred, almost. A gift I didn't need to defend to anyone. That silence, it turns out, was my first mistake. Fast forward to 3 weeks ago. My mother called and asked if she and my father could come for Sunday dinner, and could Kyle and his wife Bethany join too. That should have been my first warning sign. My mother almost never asked to come to my house. I always went to hers. I made a roast. I set the table. I was, honestly, happy. Family dinners had been rare since Frank's funeral, and some small, hopeful part of me thought maybe we were turning a corner. Dinner started normally enough. Small talk about Bethany's new job, my father's blood pressure medication, Kyle's endless, big opportunity that was always 6 months from paying off. Then, halfway through the meal, my mother put down her fork, looked at me with that smile, and said the words that started this whole story. "We've decided that it makes more sense for the cottage to go to your brother. His parents gave you, but you understand, don't you, sweetheart? Kyle and Bethany need the space more than you and Daniel do. You two don't even have kids yet." The table went quiet. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. I asked her, very carefully, what exactly she meant by "we've decided." My mother waved her hand like it was obvious. "Your father and I, and Kyle, of course. We talked it through. It only makes sense. Kyle has a family to think about. And, honestly, Rachel, Frank and Elaine always did favor you a bit much. It's time to even things out." I looked at Kyle. He wasn't meeting my eyes. He was looking at his plate, turning his wine glass slowly, and there was something about the way he wasn't reacting, no shock, no confusion, nothing, that told me this wasn't the first time he'd heard this plan out loud. I asked him directly, "Kyle, did you know about this conversation before tonight?" He shrugged. "Mom mentioned it. I mean, it's not like it's a done deal or anything, Rach. We're just talking. It's my cottage, Kyle. It was deeded to me. Not to Daniel and me. To me." My mother laughed, actually laughed, like I'd said something naive. "Well, sweetheart, deeds can be amended. Frank and Elaine weren't in their right minds toward the end, bless them, and I think if they'd really thought it through, they'd have wanted it to stay in the family the right way, split evenly, or given to whoever needs it most." That sentence, "Frank and Elaine weren't in their right minds toward the end," was the second warning sign. Because Frank had signed that deed 11 months before he died, sharp as a tack, cracking jokes with his lawyer about golf handicaps. There was nothing wrong with his mind. My mother had never even met Frank's lawyer. She had no way of knowing what state of mind he'd been in unless someone had told her otherwise. I smiled at her. I said, "Of course, Mom. Let's talk about it." But inside, my stomach had turned to ice. Because I suddenly understood, this wasn't a spontaneous family opinion. Someone had planted a story in my mother's head, a story about a confused old man and an unfair inheritance, and she was repeating it word for word, like a script. And there was only one person at that table who had a motive to write that script. I needed to find out what my brother had actually been doing. And that night, after everyone left, I started digging. The first thing I did was call Frank's old lawyer, a careful, silver-haired man named Mr. Averill, who had handled the family's affairs for 30 years. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether anyone had contacted his office recently asking about the cottage deed. There was a pause on the line that told me everything before he even spoke. "Actually, Rachel, yes," he said. "About 6 weeks ago, a man called claiming to be Frank's son, asking for a copy of the original deed and whether it could be contested on the grounds of diminished capacity. I told him that request would need to come through the estate directly and that I couldn't discuss the contents of the deed with someone who wasn't a party to it. He got a little pushy about it, if I'm honest. Frank's son was Daniel. Daniel had never made that call. I asked Mr. Averill if he remembered a name. He checked his call log and read it back to me, Kyle Whitfield. My brother had called Frank's estate lawyer, pretending or at least strongly implying that he had some standing to ask about my property, using language specifically designed to open the door to a legal challenge, diminished capacity. That's not a phrase you stumble into by accident. That's a phrase you learn because you've been looking something up. I sat with that for a full day before I did anything else. Then I called Elaine. Elaine, thankfully, was sharp as ever, living independently in a condo near the lake. I asked her, gently, if Kyle or my mother had reached out to her recently. Actually, Elaine said, your mother called me about a month ago. Very sweet on the phone, said she just wanted to catch up. But she kept steering the conversation toward Frank's last few months, asking if he'd seemed confused, if the medication had affected his memory, if I thought he really understood the paperwork he was signing near the end. I told her Frank was clearer in his last year than most men are in their prime. I thought it was an odd thing to ask, honestly, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Now I had two threads, my brother contacting the lawyer with language about incompetence, and my mother independently gathering evidence from Elaine about Frank's mental state. Two people working the same angle from two different directions. That's not a coincidence. That's a coordinated effort. I decided to test one more thing. I called Bethany, Kyle's wife, under the pretense of asking about her new job, and steered the conversation toward the cottage carefully, without accusing anyone of anything. Bethany, who has never been particularly good at hiding things, said, "Oh, Kyle's been so stressed about it. He's been talking to a lawyer friend from college about what it would take to challenge a deed like that. I keep telling him it's probably not worth the legal fees, but you know how he gets when he's set on something." There it was. Confirmation, from Kyle's own wife, that this wasn't a passing dinner table comment. My brother had been quietly building a legal case to challenge my ownership of the cottage, and my mother had been recruited to soften the ground, to make it feel, at that dinner table, like a natural family conversation rather than the opening move of a legal ambush. I asked Bethany one more question, as lightly as I could. Do you know why now? It's been almost 2 years since Frank passed. Bethany hesitated, then said the thing that made my blood run cold. Kyle's business partner backed out last month. He needs collateral for a new loan, and Mom mentioned the cottage would be perfect since it's paid off free and clear. I probably shouldn't have said that. Please don't tell him I told you. My brother didn't want the cottage because he loved it, because he had memories there, because he cared about preserving what Frank and Elaine had built. He wanted to mortgage it. He wanted to use my father-in-law's dying gift as collateral for a business loan for a venture that, knowing Kyle, would probably collapse within 18 months and take the cottage down with it. And my mother, who had visited that dying man exactly once, was helping him do it, by planting a story about an old man's confused mind to justify stealing from the daughter-in-law who had actually shown up. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm in a way that scared me a little. Because now I knew exactly what I needed to do. If Kyle wanted to fight this with paperwork and lawyers, I decided I would meet him there, except I would arrive with a case so airtight there would be nothing left to argue. My first call the next morning was to Mr. Averill. I asked him to pull together, formally, everything that documented Frank's state of mind at the time of the deed transfer, the notarized signing, Frank's competency at the time as observed by his own attorney, and, crucially, any medical records that might be relevant. Mr. Averill told me something I hadn't known, because deeds of this significance can sometimes be challenged later. He had insisted, at the time, that Frank get a brief cognitive evaluation from his primary care doctor as a precaution, purely so that the transfer would be unimpeachable. Frank had rolled his eyes about it, called it bureaucratic nonsense, but had done it anyway, to humor his lawyer. That evaluation was dated the same week as the deed signing. It showed Frank scoring in the normal range with no signs of cognitive impairment. In other words, the very challenge my brother was quietly building, that Frank hadn't been in his right mind, had already been anticipated and defeated, in writing, notarized and dated, almost a year before Kyle ever picked up the phone to ask about it. Next, I asked Mr. Avril about the phone call log. Could he provide, if needed, a written record of Kyle's call, including the date, the content, and the specific language used? He confirmed he could, and that as Frank's former attorney, he had no obligation to protect Kyle's privacy in a matter where Kyle had no legal standing. Then I did something I want to be honest about, because I know some of you might have opinions about it. The next time my mother called to check in, I let the conversation happen, and I recorded it, which is legal in my state as long as one party, me, consents. She spent 20 minutes explaining, unprompted, why it wasn't stealing for the cottage to go to Kyle, why Frank had always been a bit soft in his final year, why family property should be divided based on need, and the line that mattered most, why she thought it was smart that Kyle had looked into the legal side of things before bringing it up at dinner, so we'd know our options. My mother had just confirmed, on tape, that this had been planned as a strategy before that dinner ever happened. I also reached out to Daniel, my husband, and told him everything I'd found. I want to pause here and say, Daniel had no idea any of this was happening. He was stunned, and then he was furious, not at me, but at his own family history intersecting with mine in the worst possible way. He offered to call his mother, Elaine, immediately, and together they decided that Elaine, as Frank's surviving spouse and someone with first-hand knowledge of his mental state, would be willing to provide a written statement if it ever came to that. By the end of that week, I had a notarized deed, properly executed, with a contemporaneous cognitive evaluation proving Frank's full competency. A documented phone call from Kyle to the estate attorney, using language specifically aimed at challenging the deed on false grounds. A recorded conversation with my mother confirming premeditation and coordination. A witness statement willing and ready from Frank's own widow. And a motive, straight from Kyle's wife. He needed the cottage as collateral for a risky loan, not out of love for the family legacy, but out of financial desperation. I wasn't just prepared to defend my ownership. I was prepared to make my mother and my brother deeply, publicly regret ever bringing this to my dinner table. I didn't want to do this quietly over the phone, where my mother could later claim I was exaggerating or overreacting, the way she always had when I pushed back on anything growing up. I wanted witnesses. I wanted it on the record, in front of the same family members who had heard her make that announcement in the first place. So I did something my mother taught me. In a way, I invited everyone back for dinner. I called it a family conversation about the cottage, which was true. My parents came. Kyle and Bethany came. Daniel sat beside me. And this time, I asked Elaine to join us too, which visibly unsettled my mother the moment she walked through the door. We made it through appetizers with idle chatter before my mother, predictably, tried to steer things back toward her narrative. So, Rachel, have you given more thought to what we discussed? I really do think it's the fair thing to. I have given it a lot of thought, actually, I said. I spent the last 3 weeks looking into it very carefully. I'd like to share what I found, if that's all right. I laid the folder on the table. I started calmly, factually, the way Frank himself would have wanted it done, no shouting, no accusations, just the truth in order. I explained that Frank had undergone a cognitive evaluation the same week he signed the deed, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of challenge, and that it showed him fully competent. I watched my mother's face change. I explained that Mr. Avril had a documented record of a call from someone identifying himself as Kyle Whitfield, asking specifically about challenging the deed on grounds of diminished capacity, 6 weeks before this whole conversation had spontaneously come up at dinner. Kyle's face went white. Bethany wouldn't look up from the table. Then I played, on my phone, about 90 seconds of the recorded call with my mother, just the part where she said, clear as day, asterisk, it's smart that Kyle looked into the legal side of things before bringing it up at dinner, so we'd know our options. Asterisk. My mother tried to interrupt, tried to say I had no right to record her, that this was a private conversation, that I was twisting her words. I let her finish, and then I said, quietly, Mom, you said those words. I didn't twist anything. I just wrote them down. Finally, I turned to Elaine and asked if she would share what she remembered about the conversation my mother had with her weeks earlier. Elaine, steady as ever, described exactly what she'd told me, the leading questions about Frank's confusion, questions Elaine had found strange enough to remember clearly. The table was silent. My father, who I should mention had said almost nothing this entire time, finally spoke. He looked at my mother and asked, in a low voice I'd rarely heard him use, "Diane, is this true? Did you two plan this before you ever sat down at her table?" My mother didn't answer. Kyle did, finally, breaking the silence with something between an excuse and a confession. I needed the collateral, okay? My partner backed out, the loan was falling through, and Mom said the cottage was just sitting there, and it wasn't fair that Rachel got it all when I actually needed it. I wasn't trying to steal it. I was going to pay it back. Pay back what, exactly, Kyle? I asked. You weren't asking to borrow it. You were building a legal case to take it from me by claiming Frank was too confused to know what he was signing. That's not a loan. That's fraud, and it's exactly what Mr. Averill would have told a judge if you'd actually gone through with it. I told them both, calmly, that I wasn't interested in destroying my family over this, but that I also wasn't interested in pretending it hadn't happened. I told my mother that if she ever again claimed, to anyone, that Frank hadn't been of sound mind, I would provide the medical evaluation, the attorney's statement, and the recording to whoever needed to see it, including, if necessary, a judge. I told Kyle that if he ever contacted Mr. Averill's office again, or attempted to file any claim against the deed, I would pursue it as attempted fraud, and Bethany's name had already come up in my research, whether he liked it or not. My mother left that night without finishing her meal. Kyle didn't speak to me for almost 2 months. I won't pretend this had a fairy tale ending, because real families are messier than that. My father called me a week later, alone, and apologized, not just for that dinner, but for a lifetime of watching my mother favor Kyle and saying nothing. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase 30 years. But it was the first time in my life he'd acknowledged the pattern out loud, and it mattered more than I expected it to. My mother, to this day, has never apologized directly. She's mentioned, in passing, that she may have been misled by Kyle about the situation, which is its own kind of lie, since the recording proves she was an active participant, not a passive bystander. I've stopped expecting the apology I actually deserve. I've made peace with the fact that some people would rather protect the story they tell about themselves than admit the truth about what they did. Kyle's business partner situation, as it turns out, collapsed anyway, cottage or no cottage. He and Bethany are still working through it. I don't know if we'll ever be close again, but we speak now, carefully, at the occasional holiday gathering. The cottage is still mine. Daniel and I spent last July 4th there, on the same dock where his parents got married in 1979, and we lit a small fire in the wood stove, the one that still smokes a little if you don't open the flue all the way, and I thought about Frank, and how he told me nobody could take this from me. He was almost right. Somebody tried. They just didn't count on me finding out exactly how, and exactly why, before they ever got the chance. If there's a lesson in this, I think it's this. The people who plan to take something from you rarely announce it honestly. They dress it up as fairness, as family duty, as evening things out. My mother smiled when she said it because she expected me to smile back and hand it over, the way I always had before. What she didn't expect was that I'd already stopped being the version of myself who apologizes for having something good. I kept the cottage. I kept the truth on the record. And for the first time in my life, my family finally had to look at exactly who they really were, not who they'd always claimed to be.